Hi, I'm Writing with Andrew. Has this ever happened to you? One minute you're enjoying your day and then someone asks you what you think of their poem. When you start to answer, they shut you down and say they only write for themselves. Well, has it? If not, maybe you've been the perpetrator of the insidious line, I only write for myself. Either way, I'm here to introduce you to my simple one-step plan for being a better poet. Are you ready? Here it comes. You cannot write for yourself. That's it. That's my one-step solution.
That's never it. It's never simple.
But there's more to it than that.
See, I knew it. Settle in, everyone.
I mean, yes, of course, you can write for yourself. There's a whole culture of journals and diaries and professors with sticky notes pasted to their computer monitors and grocery lists and to-do lists. Writing for yourself is normal and necessary. But writing poetry, or any kind of literature really, is a different beast. Because poetry is inherently meant to communicate. More fundamentally, language is meant to communicate. Sure, there are ways of using language for augmenting your memory or processing your emotions, but a poem isn't a journal entry. Writing for yourself is not a path to poetic success.
But I have to write for myself. Every mortal is too cognitively deficient to comprehend my brilliance.
Well, we don't all have that challenge, but writing for yourself generally brings its own set of counterproductive issues. As Ted Kooser has put it, I've inadvertently written lots of poems that meant nothing to anybody else, and I've mailed those poems to editors from coast to coast hoping that they would be published, only to realize when they were rejected that I'd written them just for myself. I'd been delighted by what I'd written, but I hadn't thought enough about the person reading it. And that's really what we're getting at today. If you do private writing because you like it or because it helps you process your feelings at the end of the day, that's all fine and good, and I'm not here to take that away from you. But if you have any aspirations of having readers, or of saying something to someone else with your poetry, or of publishing it, you absolutely cannot be writing just for yourself. You have to make the switch to writing for them. In fact, that's been identified in the literature as one of the most significant shifts a writer can make in their development. Beginning writers write for themselves. They write what Linda Flower calls writer-based writing, as she asks the question, why do papers that do express what the writer meant, to his or her own satisfaction, often fail to communicate the same meaning to a reader? The answer, she argues, can often be traced to the writer's underlying strategy for composing, and to his or her failure to transform private thought into a public, reader-based expression. That is, because you are the writer, you will always have an easier time understanding your work, because you come preloaded with all the experiences, assumptions, and feelings that you hope to instill in a reader. But readers come to your work fresh, without all the knowledge that you bring to it by default. So the goal shouldn't just be to express yourself. The goal should be to help your reader understand what you want them to understand. Like Kooser, when you write for yourself, you write poems that readers won't care about. And if you want people to read or care about your poems, then just writing for yourself is the least effective strategy you can adopt. So, a lot of writers for themselves are resistant to this idea. But as we get into it, please rest assured that the danger of writing for yourself is not just an idea that I came up with. It's an established part of the research on writing that goes back to the 1970s. So you can't write for yourself. But how do you go about writing for readers, and what does that really mean for your poetry? That, I think, is the more interesting side of this discussion, so let's begin by imagining your reader. Now, if we were in the classroom, I would give you a sheet of paper with a blank outline of a person and a series of questions to answer. Then I'd give you some time to decorate your outline to look like your intended reader and ask you what you knew about your reader based on the questions. Of course, we're not in the classroom, but we can still take some time to complete this exercise together. So, as you think about your reader, take some notes about the following. What does your reader do for a living? What do they do in their free time? When they read, where are they? What do they care about? What delights them? What makes them sad? What really matters to them? Why do you think they read poems? If you're Ted Kooser in his poem Selecting a Reader, your reader is a woman in an old raincoat who happens upon your poetry book in the store, thumbs through it, and then decides that she could afford to have her raincoat cleaned instead of paying for a poetry book. But let's take a moment to think about that. If that's the kind of reader Kuser imagines reading his poems, how does that shape the way that he writes? If you're writing for someone who is willing to spend some time with your work, someone who goes to bookstores in the afternoon but would sooner have her coat cleaned than buy your book, what does that mean for your poems? Well, you know you won't have the reader's attention for a long time, so a poem that can be read and enjoyed pretty quickly seems important. And this person seems practical. They're more likely to pay for dry cleaning than poetry, so you probably can't afford to indulge in all of the obscurity and pretentiousness that people often accuse poets of. If she finds your book at the loneliest moment of an afternoon, then you can rest assured that, practical though she is, your reader still seeks out poetry. She still wants to experience the art and beauty of it all, and perhaps she wants some sense of companionship or connection through literature. So you'll want to write poems that, though simple and functional, they are still beautiful and still full of relationships. And if you spent any time reading Kuser's work, you'll probably recognize some of these patterns across the many poems he's written and published. They are simple and functional and beautiful and full of people and heart, and they would never make me feel bad for having my coat cleaned rather than paying for them. Having a reader in mind has shaped the way Kuser approaches his work. But don't misunderstand, I'm not telling you to write like Ted Kuser. I had a teacher once who liked the work of the poet Dean Young, who wrote a very different reader-centric poem called Dear Reader, which, like all the poems we're discussing, is linked in the description. Here, he tells the reader, "My nightmares are your confetti, so you may step over tiny skulls like a satrap among unhousebroken whippets." Later, he hands this to the reader, calling it your lift ticket, your perfume that lingers in the fire-fickled room long after you've vamoosed and made that poor boy realize he missed his chance. Your bones already asterisks, your chipmunk glance a schwa. To be brief, I don't know who Young's reader is, but I'm pretty sure it's not me. Listen, as much as I find the rhythms and sounds of this poem totally delightful, and the diction so offbeat and fun, I also find the piece a little needlessly confounding. What do you mean by bones or asterisks? How and why is my glance a schwa? Your nightmares are my confetti?
No, that one's easy. Nightmares are the confetti of the mind. One man's nightmare is another cosmic entity's party.
I mean, I guess if it works for you, that's what counts. But do you see what I mean? My teacher loved that kind of stuff, and I don't really care about it. Dean Young and Ted Kuser are both writing for readers, but they're writing for different readers. And I'm not here to tell you who you should be writing for, but I am going to tell you that you should have someone in mind. Why? Because as we've seen, who you're writing for will shape how you write. So maybe let's imagine this map of readers. The closer you get to the center, the more personally invested in poetry the readers are. The more you move to the edges, the more casually connected to poetry they get. If you wanted to map out the possible readers that Ted Kuser is writing for, you could probably enclose a pretty large circle. Big-time poetry fans like me like his work a lot, but casual readers also find a lot to enjoy in his work too. Dean Young, on the other hand, probably doesn't have as much appeal in the periphery, and there are even enthusiasts like me who don't get a lot from his work. And in our last video, we talked about the work of Edgar Guest. His readership might look a lot like this. Lots of popularity among the public and lots of scorn among literary poets. If you want to write silly limericks about dragons for your friends on Discord, you can, and your readership might look like this. If you want to write obscure, highly erudite poems that require detailed knowledge of Persian mythology, electrochemistry, contemporary Norwegian politics, and a passing fluency in Esperanto, well, you absolutely can, but don't be surprised or irritated when your readership looks less like this and more like this. But that small group of readers might be passionately invested in what you have to say. The point is, when you have a reader in mind, you can make the switch from writing incomprehensible, self-indulgent, or solipsistic journal entries that rhyme into writing poems that have something to say it clearly, and that are truly meaningful to their readers. And to some extent, I do realize that your intended reader is, at best, an imaginary friend. In some ways, Chase Twitchell is really explicit about it. In To the Reader, Twilight, we read, "Whenever I speak directly into the ear of the sky, it's you I'm thinking of." But then she says, I don't know who hears me. As Walter Ong famously put it, the writer's audience is always a fiction. But it's a useful fiction because the expectation that your work will be read will discipline your writing in a way that just writing for yourself never could. Think of it like this. How do you feel when you hear two people talking and laughing and you ask what's going on and they say, "Oh, you had to be there"? Do you enjoy being on the outside of an inside joke?
I feel like I live on the inside of an outside joke, actually.
The point is that your reader doesn't want to feel like they had to be there to get your poem. You were there, and that's great for you. But when you're writing for a reader, you're going to want to make the choices that will help that reader to feel like they were there and not like they're being left out of the loop. And listen, it's hard enough to get people to read poetry at all. As Kuzer writes, we've become accustomed to being confronted by poems that confuse, baffle, embarrass, and intimidate us. And for a lot of people, reading poetry is a dreadful experience. That is, an experience full of dread. As poets, we need to think about breaking down reader resistance, and having a reader in mind can help. Writing a poem that implicitly says you had to be there is not going to do much to break down a reader's resistance, no matter how cathartic it was for you to write about that thing that none of the rest of us know what it is. For readers who bear the burden of their 10th grade English teacher saying, "What does this poem mean?" and then making them feel stupid for not saying something about the material conditions of the Victorian coal shoveler, writing a poem that feels like an inside joke isn't going to earn you an admiring audience. And again, I'm not here to say that you have to have an admiring audience. But if you want one, and I think very many writers do, you want to be mindful of how you are relating to your readers through your poems. Even if you don't have a detailed profile of your reader in mind, knowing that there's at least someone out there reading can help you to make sure that you're giving them the help they need to feel like they're on the inside rather than the outside. So, if I can point you to one more bit of rhetorical theory.
Which is just the right thing to do in a poetry series.
Hey, they're the ones clicking on a poetry video by a guy with a thing for rhetoric. Besides, look at me explaining the theory and not just saying they had to be there.
Wow, life imitating art. How inspiring. Just make your point, bud.
Fine. Well, according to Wayne Booth, we can think of writing as an exercise in establishing a relationship. And it's really up to you to decide what kind of a relationship you want with your reader. Are you going to be a pedant who is so consumed with what you have to say and pays no attention to making it legible or appealing to an audience? Are you going to be like an advertiser and not care what you say, so long as you're winning friends and influencing people? Or are you going to strike a balance and be true to what you have to say, but discipline that with the necessity of actually communicating to your readers? And whether he knows it or not, Kuzer agrees with Booth. A poem is the invited guest of its reader, he says. No poem has ever entered a reader's life without an invitation. No poem has the power to force the door open. No one is going to read your poem just because it's there. And really, that's the lesson. The mere act of writing doesn't entitle you to an audience. So when you realize that and think about not how your writing serves your need for self-expression, but your reader's need for whatever they hope to gain from your writing, then you're on the fruitful path to cultivating an appreciative readership. In other words, we're back to where we started. If a poet's job is to be of service, then a poet needs to understand their reader's needs and wants in order to render meaningful service in the first place. So I hope it's clear that you absolutely cannot just write for yourself. But before we quit, I want to turn everything on its head and remind you that you must. Of course you have to write with your reader in mind if you hope to have readers. But if you are an artist, and poets are artists, then your job is not to please your reader at any cost. Please your reader, yes, do everything you can to engage and accommodate and delight your reader, but do it by expressing yourself. Do it while saying what you have to say. My favorite poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, wrote some of the most incredible poems I've read, but they were only published after he died. Did he have readers in mind as he wrote? I can't really say. But I have to acknowledge that the technical brilliance and meaningful insight of his work are the products of a singular mind going about the task of poetry in a unique and wonderful way. If Hopkins was only concerned about the market, we'd probably not have anything close to what we actually got. So the key, as always, is balance. Everything we discuss when we discuss poetry is and will be marked by some kind of tension. You had better not write for yourself, but you can't afford not to. You can't do both, but you also have to do both. In general, though, I don't usually encounter poets who need help being truer to themselves. It's far more common that I encounter poets who write incomprehensible or solipsistic diary entries in verse because they haven't thought about the need to communicate, or the need to earn a reader's trust by giving that reader a way into the poem. Poems aren't riddles, and they shouldn't be inside jokes either. By keeping your reader in mind, you'll be well on your way to writing poems that matter. Poems that can, in turn, earn their place as a meaningful part of their readers' lives. So keep thinking about your readers. Do what you can to understand who they are and what they hope to get from your writing. Of course, it can change from poem to poem, but it's always worth remembering that readers aren't a given, so it's your job to make sure that your work serves them as well as it can. When we come back to this series, we'll continue building on this foundation by talking about how you can let your readers into your work once you've decided who they are. In the meantime, though, be sure to read the poems linked in the description and check out the exercises and prompts I'm posting on Substack for paid subscribers if you're interested. Either way, thank you so much for joining us today, and take good care until we meet again.